Welcome back to the deep dive. We're always swimming in this sea of information, right? Trying to figure out what to trust, what to believe. It can be exhausting.
Absolutely. It's overwhelming for sure. And I think you picked a really great area for us to dive into today. How do we actually sift through all that information? And how do we figure out what's good and what's not?
Well, and you shared a research article that digs into exactly that. It's called The Role of Individual Differences in Sourcing, a Systematic Review. And just that title alone, I think, captures what we're talking about today.
Yeah, it was published back in 2022 in Educational Psychology Review. It's not just one study. It's a review of a whole bunch of research on how people approach information and specifically how they evaluate where it's coming from.
Which for you, the learner, is essential, right? You're all about figuring out the best ways to learn new things, to stay informed, but to do it efficiently and effectively.
Right. You don't want to just be taking in everything you see. You want to be able to filter it.
Exactly. So our mission today is to kind of break down this idea of sourcing and see how it plays a role in becoming a more discerning consumer of information. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is sourcing in this context? It's more than just glancing at a URL, right?
Right. I mean, we all do that, right? We see a headline, maybe we check out the website name quickly. But sourcing, as it's defined in this research, is a much more active process.
Okay, so it's like dot consciously engaging with the source.
Yeah. It's about paying attention to and then actually understanding and then using information about the source itself to decide, okay, is this something I should pay attention to?
So we're not just talking about the content itself, but the context around it, right?
Exactly.
So,
So that context includes things like who the author is,
yeah.
the type of publication. Is it a peer-reviewed journal, a news website, a personal blog? Where did this information come from and when was it created or updated? These are all pieces of the sourcing puzzle.
That's fascinating. And I think, instinctively we already do some of that. But why have researchers really zeroed in on sourcing? Why is it such a crucial skill?
Well, the researchers in this review argue that being able to source information effectively is absolutely vital in today's world. I mean, we're flooded with information constantly.
Right, it's coming from every direction.
Exactly. And it's not all created equal. Some of it is high quality, some of it is not so much. Sourcing helps us be critical thinkers, critical learners. When we consider the source, we're much more likely to prioritize reliable information and make better judgments about what to believe, and ultimately how to act.
Okay, so it's not just about being informed, it's about being informed with the right information. And you mentioned that researchers have been studying this for decades. Where did this line of research even begin? Who first started thinking about this in this way?
So this article highlights a really important study from 1991 by a researcher named Sam Weinberg. What he did was he compared how expert historians and high school students approached the same set of historical documents. And what he found was really striking. The historians engaged deeply with sourcing right from the start. Before they even looked at the content of the document, they were looking at who wrote it, what type of document it was, like a diary entry versus an official report, and when it was created.
So they were trying to understand its context.
Exactly. They were
Yeah.
basically trying to size up, okay, where's this information coming from and how might that influence what it's saying?
Whereas the high school students,
The high school students tended to completely ignore the source information. They went straight to the content, which, on the surface seems logical. But they weren't necessarily considering the biases, the motivations, the perspectives of the author or the organization behind the document.
wow. So that's a huge difference. You've got the experts building up all of this context before they even get into the information, and the students are just diving in. I imagine that 1991 study was really influential in getting people thinking about this.
It really was, and it actually paved the way for a framework that's still used today, something called the documents model.
The documents model. Okay, tell me more about that. What does it say?
So the documents model suggests that when we're reading, especially when we're reading multiple documents on a single topic, we don't just create one understanding of the content,
Okay.
what they call the situations model. We also build a mental representation of the sources themselves and how those sources relate to the content and even to each other. They call this the intertext model.
So the intertext model is like the map of where the information is coming from.
Yes, it's the connections between those sources, who's agreeing with who's disagreeing, what might their motivations be. This model says you need both of those things, the situations model and the intertext model, to be a really discerning reader. Think about reading news articles from different outlets. You're not just paying attention to what they're saying, but also to their reputation and their potential biases.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've defined sourcing. We've seen how it's important for critical thinking, and we've touched on how the experts approached it differently. The article you shared really delves into individual differences. What does that tell us about how our own unique characteristics influence our ability to source well?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. This review looks at how our existing knowledge, our reading abilities, our motivations, even our beliefs can impact how well we engage in sourcing.
Mm.
Why are some people naturally more inclined to question where information's coming from while others aren't?
Right. It's not just about knowing how to do it, but also about the factors that might make us more or less likely to actually do it.
Exactly. So they looked at a ton of research, studies published all the way from 1991 up to 2020, and they identified several categories of individual differences that seem to play a role.
Okay. What were those categories?
Well, the first one is pretty straightforward: reading skills and strategies.
Okay. Makes sense.
This includes basic reading fluency, how well we comprehend text, and the strategies we use to understand what we're reading.
Mm.
If you're struggling to decode the words, you're probably not going to be able to think critically about the source.
Right. So reading comprehension is a big one. What else?
They also looked at cognitive factors, like prior knowledge. How much do we already know about the topic? Working memory capacity. How well can we hold information in our minds as we're reading? Reasoning abilities. Can we make logical connections and see potential biases?
Those all seem pretty important too. If you already have some background knowledge, maybe you can spot a questionable source more easily. And if you can hold more information in your mind at once, you can probably keep track of multiple sources and their perspectives.
Yeah, exactly. Another category was motivation and engagement. How interested are we in the topic? What's our attitude toward it? How much do we actually value the effort involved in really understanding it?
I feel like we can all relate to that. If you're just skimming something quickly, you're probably not going to be as careful as when you're really trying to learn something in depth.
Right. Then they looked at something really interesting: beliefs. This includes our beliefs about the topic itself, but also our more general beliefs about knowledge. What counts as good evidence? What are trustworthy sources? How do we know what we know?
Which, again, that kind of comes back to you and the different viewpoints.
It does. If you believe there's only one right answer, you might just seek out sources that confirm your view. But if you have more of an open mind, maybe you're more critical of all sources.
That's a good point. What other factors did they look at?
They also considered expertise. How much specialized knowledge or experience do we have in the particular domain we're reading about? We kind of saw that with the historians. They're really good at sourcing historical documents because that's their area expertise.
Right. And the final category.
Finally, they touched on personality.
Hmm.
Now, this was an area where there wasn't as much research, but they did look at things like need for cognition, meaning how much people enjoy engaging in complex thought. They also looked at whether people have a fixed or growth mindset, meaning, do you believe your intelligence is set, or can you learn and grow?
It makes sense that someone who enjoys thinking deeply might be more likely to question their sources. So that's a pretty comprehensive overview of all the factors that might be at play. What did the researchers conclude after reviewing all these studies? Did they find strong support for all those initial assumptions about how these things relate to sourcing?
That's where it gets kind of tricky. What's fascinating about this review is that while they found a lot of research on these individual differences, the findings weren't always clear-cut. It's not always a simple case of X leads to Y. Sourcing, like so much in learning, is really complex.
Okay, so it's not as simple as if you have more prior knowledge, you'll always be a better sourcer.
Exactly. Let's take prior knowledge as an example.
Hmm.
Intuitively, you might think that the more you know, the better you'd be at sourcing, right?
Right.
And some theories do suggest that. But there are also theories that propose that having less knowledge might actually lead you to focus more on source cues because you're less able to evaluate the content itself. It's like if you're in a new city and you don't know your way around. You might pay more attention to street signs and landmarks because you're relying on external cues to navigate.
That makes sense. So what was the overall takeaway about prior knowledge?
The review found that having at least a basic level of prior knowledge on the topic often did correlate with better sourcing, especially when people were prompted to evaluate the forces. But if someone has very little knowledge, the connection isn't as strong. It seems like you need a certain foundation to be able to think critically about sources.
Okay, so there's like a threshold effect. You need some knowledge to really engage with those sources. What about reading comprehension? That seemed like another big one.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense, right? If you're a skilled reader, you're better able to pick up on the nuances, to identify potential biases, and to process all that information about the source itself.
Right.
And the review did find that about half of the studies showed a link between reading comprehension and sourcing. What was interesting, though, is that the way they measured reading comprehension seemed to matter.
Oh, ho.
Studies that used tasks that required deeper understanding and drawing inferences were more likely to find a connection with sourcing than those that just used simpler reading tests.
So it's not just about being able to read the words, it's about really comprehending the meaning and maybe even reading between the lines.
Exactly. And they also found that, again, like with prior knowledge, if people weren't explicitly prompted to think about the source, or if their sourcing skills were already weak, that connection was harder to see.
Interesting. Now, I'm always interested in how people engage with different viewpoints. Did they find that being interested in a topic led to better sourcing?
That's actually a really interesting finding. Just being interested in a topic, at least, self-reported interest didn't consistently predict better sourcing.
That's surprising.
The researchers think that maybe self-reported interest doesn't always translate into actually engaging with the source information. Maybe someone's interested, but they're still not thinking critically about where the information's coming from.
Right. They might be more focused on the content itself, like, oh, this is interesting, but not where did this come from and why should I believe it?
Exactly. They suggest that maybe looking at situational interest, like how engaging the actual materials are, or observing someone's actual behavior, how much time they spend reading from different sources, might be more telling. And maybe, sometimes, being very interested in a topic might actually lead us to be less critical of sources that agree with what we already believe.
Okay, so interest can be a double-edged sword. That's really fascinating. Now, what about our deeper beliefs about knowledge? That seemed like a really important part of the review.
Yeah, that's a big one. So there's a whole area of research called epistemic beliefs, which basically looks at our theories about what knowledge is and how we know things. And the review found a strong link between these beliefs and sourcing. People who believe that knowledge is complex, that it's always evolving, and that it's based on evidence and expertise tend to be more critical of sources.
Which makes sense. If you don't think there are absolute truths, you're probably going to be more careful about where you're getting your information from.
Exactly. That's called an evaluativist perspective. And on the flip side, people who have more absolutist beliefs, meaning they think there are absolute truths and we should just trust authority figures, or what they call a multiplist perspective, where they believe all opinions are equally valid, those folks were less likely to critically evaluate sources. And what's interesting is that measuring these beliefs in relation to this specific topic seem to be more predictive of sourcing behavior than measuring general beliefs about knowledge.
Right, so if I'm reading about a scientific topic, my beliefs about science are probably more important than my general philosophy about truth. What about how sourcing is actually measured in these studies? Does that make a difference in the findings?
It actually does. So researchers use a lot of different ways to assess sourcing, everything from simply asking people to recall the author of a document to asking them to make judgments about the credibility of different sources. And what they notice is that when people are prompted to think about the source, the relationship between those individual differences, like prior knowledge or reading comprehension, and their sourcing behavior becomes a lot clearer.
Okay, so if I'm specifically asked, who wrote this, or how credible is this source, I'm more likely to really think about it and apply my knowledge and skills.
Right. And the reverse was true, too. When they measured sourcing more spontaneously, like if someone just happened to mention the source in an essay, for example, the connection to individual differences was weaker.
So maybe our potential to source well is actually higher than we show in everyday life simply because we're not always actively thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It suggests that just reminding ourselves to pay attention to sources could really improve how we evaluate information.
Now, I'm also curious about the topic itself. Does it matter what we're reading about? Like, is sourcing different when we're reading about health versus science, for example?
They did find some differences between domains. For instance, prior knowledge seemed to be more consistently related to sourcing when people were reading about science topics compared to health topics.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
They speculate that maybe it's because scientific knowledge often has these more established structures and, hierarchies of expertise. Knowing the difference between, say, a peer-reviewed scientific journal and a health blog might be more clear-cut than in other areas.
Right. There might be more generally agreed upon markers of credibility.
Yeah, exactly. They also found that studies on historical topics tended to look at fewer individual differences compared to the health or science studies.
That's interesting. So it seems like there's still a lot more to explore. Did the article talk about any gaps in the research or areas that need more study?
They did. They pointed out several key gaps. For example, we talked about motivation, but they haven't really studied things like achievement goals. How much people are motivated to master the material or self-efficacy beliefs, how much people believe in their ability to succeed in the context of sourcing.
Okay.
And similarly with personality, they've mainly focused on need for cognition. But there could be other personality traits that are relevant too.
Right.
And maybe the biggest gap they highlighted is the lack of research on sourcing when we're online.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
I mean, think about how much information we encounter online and how quickly we're making decisions about what to click on and what to read.
Right. We're constantly filtering.
Exactly. And they point out that we need more research on how those split-second decisions are influenced by our individual differences and how that then affects how we evaluate the information once we actually read it.
Yeah. That's a huge area for future research. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. For the learner who wants to really make the most of this information, what are some of the key takeaways from this deep dive into sourcing?
Okay, I think a few things stand out based on this review.
Mm-hmm.
First, building up at least some base level of knowledge on a topic seems to really help with sourcing.
Okay.
Second, strong reading comprehension skills,
Hmm.
especially the ability to draw inferences and understand complex arguments, are really important.
So don't just skim, folks.
Don't just skim.
Okay.
Third, be aware of your own beliefs about knowledge.
Mm.
Are you open to questioning sources, to looking for evidence, or do you tend to just trust certain authorities or just go with your gut feeling?
Okay.
Fourth, make source evaluation an active process. It shouldn't be something that happens in the background. Consciously ask yourself about the source. Who created it? What might their motivations be? What makes them credible or not?
Good advice.
And finally, remember that the context matters.
Mm-hmm.
What type of information is it? What field is it in? Those things can influence what a good source looks like.
That's really helpful advice. It really highlights that becoming a critical thinker, a discerning learner, isn't just about taking in information. It's about understanding where that information is coming from and having the tools to evaluate its credibility.
Mhm.
And that brings us to a final thought for you, the learner. We've seen today that becoming truly well-informed requires not just reading or listening, but deeply understanding the origins of information and building up those critical evaluation skills. So here's something to ponder. How can we make evaluating sources a regular part of our learning process, regardless of the topic? What if, every time we encountered new information, we took a moment to really think about its source? It might be a small change in habit, but it could make a big difference in how we understand the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.